Man who is to be the overlord or supreme boss, or call him what you like, one hopes anyway, the solver of Britain's transport problems, is Lord Hinton of Bankside, who was formerly chairman of the Central Electricity Generating Board. His appointment to the top transport job was announced this afternoon. What lies ahead of Lord Hinton, one wonders, in trying to solve or stop the strangulation of Britain by its own transport? There is one man who must know the problems probably better than anyone else, and who himself had in fact been expected to take on the top transport job until he announced recently that he was going back to industry. I refer, of course, to Dr. Richard Beeching, who sits with me here in the studio. Dr. Beeching, why have you not taken the supreme job, and why are you going back to industry?
Well, it was always intended that I should go back to industry, and of course I was seconded to do the job as chairman of the Railways Board, and I had already planned to go back in the middle of this year, before I was asked whether I would do the job of surveying the transport system as a whole. And I would have done the job, but by the time we discussed it all, it became apparent that the way in which the job was to be done was such as to make it impossible for me to do it in the time.
Do you regret leaving the railways and going back to industry?
Oh, I shall regret it very much. Not that I shall be sorry to go back to ICI, but I shall be very sorry to leave the railways.
Now, what sort of problems do you reckon are now facing Lord Hinton? Is there any danger, do you think, that the whole of this awful transport problem, I mean cars, trains, aeroplanes, the lot, in this crowded island, has been messed about with bits and pieces for so long that there's any danger that it's insoluble now? Really?
I don't think the main problems are insoluble, with the possible exception of the urban transport problem, the problem of transport in the big cities. There a great deal of improvement can be made, but whether there will be an ultimate and satisfactory solution is doubtful. But apart from that, I think the problems are soluble, and what is more, I think a great deal of progress towards solving them has been made.
Now, the point there, I noticed that the government said today in announcing Lord Hinton's appointment that one of the things he's going to do is to carry out a great survey of the whole situation. Now, I thought that you were quoted recently as saying that you'd surveyed the thing to death, to put it quite simply, and that surveys were done and action could now come.
I wouldn't say we'd surveyed it to death, but we have done a tremendous amount of the groundwork necessary for the purpose of making decisions. And I would emphasize this isn't one big problem. It's a problem that can best be seen if it's resolved into its parts.
What sort of parts? You mean one form of transport against the other?
Yes, that, but more particularly a resolution into the purposes that transport serves. You see, it's awfully confusing if you mix up the passenger transport problem and the freight problem. What is more, the passenger transport problem is not just one. The difficulties in the big cities, in the conurbations, is quite different. The difficulties are quite different from those in the rural areas. And then a third part of the passenger transport problem is the movement of people between cities and the main centres of population. And then on the freight side, the big conflict is for the trunk haul. But many people think in terms of freight movement as the local movement in towns where there is a great deal of congestion, where they see heavy vehicles moving about, think this traffic ought to be on the railways. But it couldn't be, because the railways can't do this final scale, final distribution.
One does hear a tremendous amount about this business. Why on earth can't they carry this stuff on the railways instead of on the road? But is this freight question the one on which you're nearing a conclusion now? There's something coming out shortly, I believe.
Well, yes, it is. When we prepared the reshaping report, we foreshadowed the necessity for looking at the trunk routes. In that report, we made proposals with regard to the branch lines, but we said that in due course we would consider the trunk routes of the country.
These are the big main lines?
The big main lines, covering the flows of traffic, both passenger and freight, between the main centres of population and industry in the country. And this study has now been completed, and we're just about ready to publish the report. In fact, it'll come out next week.
What's it say?
Well, I can't tell you about that now. It's a very complicated business, of course, but it will deal with the selection of trunk routes for development in the future, to deal with the traffic of the future.
Now, could I take you for a moment away from freight to the perhaps more compelling subject of human beings and their part in transport? I mean the ordinary traveller. People don't bother, I suppose, so much about freight. They don't realise what its connection with them is, really, as private individuals. But they do worry, I think, about the way they have to travel. What have you in mind as the future for this awful snarling up of big cities that's going on? I mean, buses and tubes and things which are absolutely bursting in the rush hour, which it seems to me, can't possibly carry any more people. Well, what can we do about this? What can Lord Hinton or anybody do about this?
I don't think we can solve this problem in the sense that we can satisfy everybody by allowing them to do just what they like. But public transport can carry a lot more than it does. And this is true even of London, where the problem is most severe.
What, in the rush hour?
Yes, even in
Buses?
the rush hour. Well, at the moment, you see, the buses are very much limited in their movement by the congestion of private cars. The total number of people coming into London each day is well over 1 million. And of that total, less than 10% come in by cars. But they produce the congestion. Then the buses can't move, so that public transport is very severely handicapped by this minority of people who come in by their own private car.
Now, one talks of London as being a famous example of this problem. This applies, I suppose, to almost all the big provincial cities as well.
Yes, but to a lesser degree.
Yes.
The same problem.
Now, if a small number of motorists are getting in the way of a large number of public travellers, what's the answer to this one? Obviously, get rid of the motorists, but how on earth do you do that?
Well, I think we've got to discourage them very strongly from coming into London. And the most obvious way of doing this is to increase the cost of parking in London. Because not only do people come in, but they then congest the streets by parking in the road.
What are you going to charge them?
Well, I would charge them much more because, in fact, it costs much more to provide the parking spaces that they use. Land is very expensive in the centre of London, and if you provide off-street parking, it costs about £1,000 per car space. And this is equivalent to a daily charge of about 10 shillings, or an hourly charge of about 2 shillings.
So you'd put the meters up everywhere and make that charge payable?
I think we must do this as a first step.
But this isn't necessarily going to get rid of motor cars if people are willing to stand the price, aren't they?
It won't get rid of them, and we don't want to get rid of them, of course. We don't want to prohibit people from coming into the cities, but on the other hand, we must charge them what it really costs to allow them to come in.
What about the people who live in the cities and keep their cars permanently garaged in the street?
Well,
now, there's a problem.
This is a great difficulty, of course. There are, in some parts of London, as many cars parked in the street now as the streets can possibly take. And the car population is going to go on growing, as we all know, and it will be quite impossible for new car owners to do the same thing that those who have cars at present are doing. So that I think we must force them to make provision for garaging their own cars.
What, outside London? They can't garage them in London.
Well, they can at a price. And if the garaging of cars in the streets were to be prohibited, and if notice was given that this prohibition was going to come on, there will be a strong inducement to people to provide garaging facilities and a necessity for people to pay for them.
And supposing that you are able to freeze out a large number of motorists, I'm trying to say this without bias one way or the other on this question, supposing this succeeds, you are sure you're going to be able to carry them in your bursting suburban railway trains and your buses?
We could carry many people more than we carry at the moment, but not on all services. Some services are very badly overcrowded now, but many others have got spare capacity. And if the people were coming in the right directions, we could carry several 100,000 more than we're carrying at the present time.
Dr. Beeching, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. We come there to the end of Panorama. We'll be back next Monday at the usual time. Until then, good night.